Hi, this is Morten Jensen from the NBA show, and today we'll be discussing whether or not the Minnesota Timberwolves should rebuild. Stay tuned. So first and foremost, let's get it out of the way. You could absolutely argue that by winning the number one pick in last year's draft or draft lottery, that you are already rebuilding. That's not lost on me. And yes, the Minnesota Timberwolves, to some extent, they are already in a rebuilding process. They haven't been to the playoffs since they had Jimmy Butler, and now they don't, and they're looking at new avenues to make it to the postseason. Right now, it's not really working out, which is why we actually have to ask ourselves a question here. How is their rebuilding process going? How is their current personnel working out for them? And what is their future outlook? First and foremost, right now, they are struggling, and that's in large part because they missed Karl-Anthony Towns for a large chunk of the season. I don't think it's completely fair to look at Minnesota's 7-28 record as being this strong indicator of where they are as a franchise, because when you have missed Karl-Anthony Towns to the extent that you have, your record is going to suffer. Of course it is. That said, it isn't really helpful to them that they don't have a proper roster construction, because they don't. They're absolutely loaded at the off guard and the wing position, but it's loaded in a way that isn't really optimized. So let's take a guy like Malik Beasley, who's going to be suspended or is suspended for 12 games. He's more of an offensive-minded player. He's scoring over 20 points per game. He's been a positive revelation for the Timberwolves in terms of his shooting and his scoring. But in terms of defense, there isn't a whole lot there. And you could argue the same for D'Angelo Russell, who they traded for last trade deadline a year ago. Those two are great offensive talents, but there isn't much to be said about the defensive end from those two. Then you look at the guys like Jared Culver and Josh Okogie, and that's actually flipped. They are great individual defenders. They have great defensive upside. Offensively, however, they project to be bad. Very bad. I mean, to the point where you could argue, are they even playable for more than 20 minutes per game? Kind of bad. So you have an overabundance of offensive-only players, you have an overabundance of defensive-only players at the same position, and that's even before I bring up Anthony Edwards, who defensively also is struggling a little bit, and offensively, yes, there's a lot of potential, but he's very, very inefficient at this current stage. It's to be expected. He's 19. There's still time. But to expect Edwards to turn into a two-way force at this stage, we just don't know yet. It's too early. It could be something that he develops down the line. He certainly has the athleticism and the physicality to be a very high influential defender if he wants to. It's just a matter of dedication. But I'm putting him in an entirely different box right now because he just hasn't played enough for us to get a proper understanding of who he is and who he is going to be down the line. I think it's fair to just put him aside a little bit. So what you really have to look at here is the pairing of D'Angelo Russell and Karl-Anthony Towns. Now, they wanted to play together. That's why Russell got traded there. That is why they gave up what they did to have him play with Towns. They like each other, they're buddies, and we have just not seen enough games out of those two to actually have an opinion of where they should be. I don't, you don't, nobody should have a set opinion of that duo. Considering Towns has missed 20 games this season and Russell 15, that's a huge chunk. Russell, since being traded to the Wolves a year ago, has only appeared in 32 games. Now, that is not even remotely enough data for anyone to look at that pairing and go, well, it's not working. What I do think is fair is looking at the archetype of player that both are. Towns, while immensely great offensively, both in terms of scoring, but also just an expanding playmaking repertoire. You should really check out the Wolves this year. He is making passes that you would just not believe. He is becoming a legitimate playmaker at the 5 position. It's been wonderful to watch Towns in an offensive space. He does everything with the ball. but defensively, he's not necessarily a great player. He will have games where he looks much improved, but not to the point where you compare him to someone like Joel Embiid or Giannis Antetokounmpo, obviously. There is a certain limit to where he will go defensively. And the same can be said of D'Angelo Russell. Both have simply been in the league for too long to, well, establish himself as defensive assets for any team. That's not who they are, and it's presumably not how they're going to be. And that begs the question, can you survive when your lead guard and your primary center are bad, or at the very least below average defensively? Well, maybe if you stock up with defenders on every other position there is, you might actually be able to work it out. But then again, the guys that they do have, Okogie and Culver, they can't really relate to Russell and Towns offensively. They should be there to space the floor, and neither can. Now, Malik Beasley can, Anthony Edwards presumably can, but their defensive upside is thus swinging. If you go into a situation where it's Beasley, it's Russell, it's Edwards, and it's Towns, yeah, that lineup offensively should be potent as heck. But defensively, it would be a train wreck. So at this point, you have to ask yourself, is there something we can do here on the fly that actually helps us get to where we want to go? Or do we tear everything down and start from fresh? Now, let me clarify something which is really important. When I mention the word rebuild, I am not saying it needs to happen right now, because like I said, they haven't had enough data on a lot of these guys. I think this is a situation that you look for in the offseason, not near the March 25th NBA trade deadline. That's just too soon, you won't have the data, and hell, you could make the argument that even going into the offseason, you still would not have enough information to go on in terms of making a decision so drastic. It is crucial for the Timberwolves to find out what they have before they start reacting to it. Now, what I would suggest is something that's called a retooling process. That's a little bit different than rebuilding. Rebuilding usually means you tear everything down and you start over. A retooling process means that you stick with certain elements and you find pieces to build around those. That, in this context, means Towns and presumably Russell. So again, let's assume those two are your centerpieces. Presumably, the pieces that you end up building around would be Towns and Russell, like I mentioned before. So that means you have to make other elements available in trades so you can actually round out the roster the right way. Meaning, Beasley, Okogie, and Culver, maybe they should all be on the trade market, because the most optimal thing you can do is kind of merge those three into one player. They all have their areas of expertise, but you just cannot afford to have specialty players when you're this bad a team. You just can't. You need to have guys who are well-rounded, who can do multiple things on the basketball court. And right now, those guys can't. You're looking at a pretty clear and significant ceiling when you have one-way players. That's something the Chicago Bulls also realized a couple years ago when they kept drafting for offense in the draft. Eventually, they had too many offensive-minded players and no defense, and then they brought in defensive specialists who couldn't score, and it turned into a train wreck. The Timberwolves are heading a little bit in that same direction, and they need to pivot, and that's where the retooling process comes in. I think that's the play. So, in terms of the question, should they rebuild? No. Not yet, at least. I won't close that door until I see them get drastically better with the current main guys that they have, though. But right now, I think it would just be so much more beneficial for them to look at what they have and make adjustments, i.e. a retooling process. For the Wolves, though, it comes down to what they believe. One thing is, I can stand here in front of a camera and utter my opinion, sure. But if they have a tremendous belief in the trio of Russell, Towns, and Beasley, and they want to move forward with a very offensively inclined roster, obviously that's their right. But if they are to do this thing and go all in on offense, then I would definitely suggest to them that they get out of Jared Culver and Josh Okogie and get in shooters, like big time shooters, guys who can put up 10 3-point shots per game on a per 36 minute basis. Because if you only have one card to play, you kind of have to play it.